Hello, everyone, and welcome to BioBus Student Town Hall Live. My name is Latasha, and I'm a BioBus Scientist. This is our second town hall in our four-part series on racism and society. This series was first envisioned by BioBus junior scientists when posed with the questions of how can BioBus fight racism in society. Last week, we had an amazing session with Dr. Ovita Williams and Robin Walker, and I invite you to check that out. It was about how racism impacts all of us. And I wanted to make sure that you know that we're going to do this again 2 more times. But after this town hall, I know that you're going to have a lot of questions, and I want you to feel encouraged to keep asking questions, having those uncomfortable conversations, and understand that BioBus is here to support you. So what is BioBus? So BioBus is a nonprofit organization. We're here, located in New York City. We believe in the science for everyone. We have a mobile lab that goes to schools and communities and brings science to the people. So that's pre-COVID. But we also have a community lab called BioBus Harlem. BioBus Harlem is our community space that's located in Columbia University's Zuckerman Institute. And we share this space with Columbia Institute's public programs. And we also collaborate on many projects, such as this Town Hall series. So this Town Hall series is produced in collaboration with Zuckerman Institute. And because of the Center for Science and Society, it was funded by the Center for Science and Society. So I want to introduce to you the host of this town hall, Paula.
Hi, everybody. It's so great to be here with you today. And I'm so excited to present this town hall. My name is Dr. Paula Croxon, or Paula, and I am a neuroscientist. I am a science communicator. I run the public programs at Columbia University's Zuckerman Institute, which is a neuroscience institute based in Harlem. I'm also a storyteller. I love to tell stories about science, and a musician. And I am very excited to introduce our two special guests for today. We have two amazing academics and activists with us today. I'm going to introduce them briefly one by one and then ask them to introduce themselves. So our first guest today is Dr. Robert E. Fullilove. He's the Associate Dean for Community and Minority Affairs, Professor of Clinical Sociomedical Sciences, I just about got that right, and he's a co-director of the city's research group. And he usually goes by Dr. Bob or Bob. So Bob, I'd love to introduce you to, encourage you to introduce yourself.
First thing to do is to unmute myself. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm a professor in the School of Public Health at Columbia University. Much of what I've done for the last 35 years has been involved with looking at epidemics like the one we're dealing with right now, COVID-19. I started my career in public health doing research with Mindy Thompson-Fullilove, my wife at that moment, and we did a lot of work on HIV/AIDS. A disease that is still with us, probably the most important virus epidemic that we've had in the last century. And because it's still with us today, a lot of what we learned about HIV is helping us understand what to do with COVID-19. How about I stop there?
That is absolutely perfect. Thank you so much, Bob. And our second special guest for today is Dr. Dana E. Crawford. She is psychology at Crawford Bias Reduction Theory and Training. And she usually goes by Dana. So Dana, I'd love to encourage you to introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. Hi, I am a pediatric pediatric and clinical psychologist. What that means as a pediatric psychologist is that I specifically examine the ways that medical conditions impact children and youth and their families. But my role in research is really looking at how do we systematically reduce our racism, prejudice, and bias as a society in the world. And today I'll be talking specifically about science. However, outside of all of those things and all things science, I am really interested in ways that people can connect, figure out ways that we can be better allies for each other and better citizens of the world. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today. Thank you so much for your time.
That's so wonderful. Thank you so much. And we're very excited to have Dana as the scholar in residence at the Zuckerman Institute this year. So that's very exciting for us. So welcome to both of you. I also want to invite Marina to introduce yourself. Marina is a BioBus scientist, and she's going to be taking your questions from the chat. Marina, say hello.
Hi, everyone. My pronouns are she, her. And I'll be collecting your questions in the chat and asking them to our scientists. So please make sure to submit as many questions as you want.
Thank you so much. All right, so as well as questions in the chat, you all submitted some amazing questions ahead of time. So I'm going to start off by asking those to Dana and Bob. Please continue to ask questions in the chat and tell us your name, age, and school when you do that, so we can pass those on. And there are rules to this game. And the rules are, Dana and Bob, you have 3 minutes to answer each question that is given to you. So if everybody's ready, let's go. I'm going to start with a question for Dana, and this question is from Angel. Dana, why is racism a thing, and why did it start?
Angel, thank you so much for taking time to write a question to us. It's a really complex answer to talk about why racism started. To even think about the start of racism, it's really crucial that you identify what type of racism you're talking about. So I like to just boil it down to 3 main types of racism. First is individual racism. That has to do with how you think about things, how you perceive people of different races. The second has to do with interpersonal racism. That has to do with how you interact with people within your own race as well as cross-racially. The last is more of the institutional, systemic, systematic racism. And so when we talk about how they started, understanding what type we're discussing is crucial. So individual racism, in my theory, I really believe that it is part of the human condition to categorize people. All humans do this, right? From the day that you're born, is this warm? Does it make me feel cold? That new little baby is already starting to categorize. And the research does show as babies as young as 3 months old show preference for the caregiver, the race of the caregiver that is taking care of them. I think that has a lot to do with milk. This person who's brown gives me milk. I like milk. I like brown people. I feel warm. I feel loved. So we categorize because it has to do with resources, safety, and what's familiar. Interpersonal racism often is related to what you're exposed to. Who have you been around? What type of media have you consumed? I really think of it more so as a socially transmitted disease. We spread it to each other in all the ways that we connect. And at times, we don't even know that we're doing it because that's what you've been exposed to. Then the last piece, and maybe this is the question that you're really getting to, Angel, how did racism start on a systemic, institutional, structural way? I believe, and there's a lot of scholars that would challenge the origins, and this may be more of a history, it has to do with the distribution of resources. So in the early days of, as far back as we can think of, if we think about Black racism specifically, that was generated in this country and around the world as ways that people could get free labor. And so if I categorize a person as Black or different from myself or white, then I could possibly dominate and be able to get free resources from them, especially as we think about resource shortages. Racism gets perpetuated as we continue to think about the ways that resources get distributed. So resources related to funding in schools, resources in labs, resources in down to the potholes in your community. race is one way that we can decide what resources go to whom. There are other ways that people use categories to distribute resources, such as related to gender, related to the education level one might have, even down to someone's visual appearance. Attractive people tend to make more money. And so all of these ways are the things that we do to manipulate and to understand the resources that we have. Thank you for your question, Angel.
Thank you so much, Dana. Lots to think about there. So our next question is for Bob. And this question comes from Laura. Why is it important to be identified by race in society?
Well, part of what happens in the United States is that your membership in a particular race group or a particular ethnic group may have serious advantages that may go as far as assuring that if you are applying for college, you will find that there are many institutions that are particularly interested in making sure that you are part of the student body. It is also the case that we are often identified by the communities that we are in. And if you are in a community where everybody looks like you, everybody is from the same group, and everybody is very proud of who they are and what their history is, being a part of that group and claiming membership in it is a way of expressing pride. I think a lot about Native Americans, also called American Indians. In many places in the West, to be a member of a particular tribe sets you apart as somebody who's really important. Somebody has a noble, distinguished history. Some of that history includes oppression and having survived it. But in many instances, when people are happy to identify with a group, it's because they like its values, they like its culture, they like its language, and they may like elements of its history that they think, as a member of that group, makes me look good. So those are the things that are advantages. And there are many people, and I'm thinking that Dana may be one of them, who are very clear that if you are proud of the group that you are a part of, if you see that as a positive way of describing who you are, you will be a lot healthier. Your mental health will be better, and even your physical health will be impacted. So you may be a part of a group that others are constantly harassing and directing hateful comments towards. But if part of what your group does, part of what your community does is resist, and not only resist, do so with a certain amount of pride and power, the fact that you come from difficult backgrounds, but that you have overcome, you have survived, is also a reason why people find it's very positive to be a part of a group that has resisted the oppression that has been directed at them, has resisted the hate that is often sent their way, and because of their ability to survive, really will see that identity with that group as a source of pride. How about I stop there?
That's perfect. Thank you so much. So our next question is for Dana again. And this question comes from Poppy. And Poppy wants to know, can you be more than one race at a time?
So Poppy, thank you for the question. It's interesting because race is not an individual thing. It's co-defined. So race in itself is a social construct. Some people have even said race is not real. It is absolutely real. It has teeth and claws. And as Dr. Bob was saying, it has some very clear things that it impacts your psychological, mental health, the distribution of resources, and so forth. And so the question of, can you be more than one race? So you and yourself, you may identify based on the family that you come from that, yes, I am more than one race. I am two races. Maybe my dad is Black, my mom is white, my dad is Jewish, my mom is Latinx. Yes, you absolutely can be more than one race. The issue becomes that it's not just based on your own internal experience. You may have seen this within your friends, that people from the same family, the beauty of melanin and the magic of melanin can look differently. And so if you just Google Black-white twins, for instance, you'll see these two amazing twins that have the same biological parents, and one child is my color and the other is Paula's color. And those are actual twins. And so when people see them walking down the street, someone might say to the Black twin, like, oh, okay, you clearly can't be half white, you can't be part white, or to the white twin to say, no, you're not Black at all. Race, because it is social, it has a social component of being defined. And so I think when you ask the question, Poppy, can I be more than one race? To whom are you referring that question to? Is that to yourself? Is that to your community? And I think that it's really crucial that you think about that for yourself and also think about the different types of racism. So on an individual level, hey, you're biracial. On an interpersonal level, depending on your appearance and the way that you access resources, that might be different. And so it's not just a simple yes or no answer, but if you were to boil it down to yes or no, I think yes.
Thank you so much, Dana. Race is social. Yeah, that's something I think about a lot. Okay, our next question is for Bob. And this is a great one. These are all great questions. This one is starting to dig a little bit into the topic that we're really focusing on today, which is racism in science. And this question is from Peel. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And the question is, does racism affect the type of research being done?
Very good question. And I believe the answer is yes. For the longest time in the last century, research that tried to understand why racial differences exist often had a very, very difficult time publishing results that appeared to suggest that in America, a certain racial group, people of African descent, people whose ancestors were slaves, the point that was being made, they are not only as good as anyone else, they are currently being discriminated against. They are being oppressed. And much of what science in the early part of the 20th century did, and much of this was done by Black sciences and by Latinx sciences, was to point out, here's the way in which prejudice, bias, and racism is impacting much of what we do in American society. It was very difficult to get material like that published. There was a thought that maybe it was un-American, that somehow or other it was not patriotic to suggest that the greatest nation in the world, the United States, was somehow guilty of doing things that were less than great, that were less than noteworthy. Having that kind of work published was really, really difficult. Then there are the topics that people often choose. There has been a branch of science in the 20th century that has carried over into the 21st that tries to prove that members of different groups aren't as well connected, aren't as intelligent as other folk. For the longest time, there was a sense that if you were a person of African descent, if your ancestors were slaves, you were not as smart as someone who was white, that you were inferior with respect to your intelligence. And a lot of research went into that because it was thought that if people paid attention to things like intelligence tests, they wouldn't spend so much money on things like Black or Latinx education. So that science, it was racist, and it was literally used to impress upon the American public the idea that maybe the people who do not look like us, the people who are not white, aren't worthy of being here in this country with us. And when racism hid in the guise of science, under the mantle of science, a lot of quite evil things were done that we regret to this day. One of them, for example, was something called eugenics, which held that if you were a member of an inferior race, perhaps to keep you from having children who would weaken the United States, you should be sterilized so that you could not have children. There were many, many college campuses that had courses that said the way to make Americans and the American people better and more perfect would perhaps be to do what we can to take inferior people and keep them from multiplying, keep them from having children. That kind of eugenics science, as it was called, was something that was clearly racist and did a great deal to destroy some of the good science that was coming out of institutions like Columbia University, which used to have courses on eugenics. So yes, science can be racist, and part of what we're trying to do in this program right here is give you a sense of why it's important to, number one, be proud of whatever racial group you're in, and do what you can to use science to create equality, which is, after all, what this country is intended to be about.
Thank you so much, Bob. Absolutely. If you're just joining us, you're in the BioBus Student Town Hall. My name's Paula, and I'm here with Dana and Bob, and we're taking questions about racism in science and society. I know that we have some questions in the chat, so I'm going to pass over to Marina, and she's going to relay some of those questions.
All right, so one of these questions I think could be answered by whichever scientist feels comfortable answering. A Hawa Drame, who is 14 years old. Sorry, Hawa, if I didn't pronounce your last name right, or your first one. They're 14 years old from Beacon High School, and they want to know if there was a time where you did not get an opportunity due to your race.
So I'll start, and then hopefully, Bob, you can join me on this. You know, this is a really interesting question because the thing about racism is that it can be really sneaky. You may not know what specifically is causing the racism. You may not always be able to identify it. It's not, you know, as simple as a lab rat where you can say that was racism. It's very, sometimes it's implicit. And so I don't know if I didn't get a job specifically because of my age, to be honest, if it was related to my race. No one has ever said to me, you know, Dana, we don't want you here because you're Black. But I do think that race has played a role in my access to resources or even my awareness about jobs. Sometimes you don't know what you don't know. I didn't know to apply. I didn't know they had a job opening. And so even in the sense of networking, I do think that race has been a barrier at times to me accessing things. But also, I went to Howard University, and having gone to a historically Black institution, I do have access to a different community that I would not have had access to. So I do think that race impacts networking and that impacts opportunities. But I have not had the experience specifically where someone has explicitly said that my race was the reason that I wasn't included in a space.
Maybe the best way to answer that question is to acknowledge something that many of you out there have guessed because of my gray hair. I'm not a young guy. I've been around for a while. I'm going to be 77 years old in January, which means that I was old enough to be in the civil rights movement. So rather than say, did I have a job that I didn't get because of my race, I'm very proud of the fact that for 4 years of my life, I was part of the civil rights movement and was trying to fight that kind of racism and that kind of discrimination. That was more than 50 years ago, but much of the work that I do now is in that same direction, where I'm really concerned, and I think the question gets at this beautifully. I'm really concerned how the experience of being rejected, the experience of being discriminated against is bad for your health. The stress that's associated with that has a great deal to do with people having heart attacks, with people living with stress that can become so problematic, they become depressed, or even suffer what is called the traumatic stress disorders. So I'm very clear that if race is the cause of much of the ill health in American society, being against that should be a job, if you will, for all of us. I think I've been very fortunate because the jobs I've had have really given me an opportunity to fight those fights, to be a part of those battles. And I've met some really, really wonderful people as a result. For example, in 1964, in April, I spent a month as an intern in the offices of Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. King was always fascinated by the fact that my last name, full of love, was something that any Baptist preacher would just smile to hear. Oh, your name is what? So having been for a good part of my life engaged in those kinds of struggles, one of the reasons why I'm so happy to be here today is that the questions you're asking, I'm hoping, will give you the strength, the resolve, and the motivation to fight against racism and seek the positions that used to be denied us, but which are now available and are now helping to build our communities and keep them healthy. So I love the question. I think instead of having suffered from it, I've had a long, very productive life being a part of the battle against it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bob, and Dr. Dana for those answers. I think we have to be super vigilant when we encounter these things, especially someone like me. I would like to be extra vigilant about those things because I am a white person. We have another question from a Laura. who would like to know how they can change the way that they teach and prepare their science, psychology, specifically course materials, so that white students don't think that they are the center of the world.
So I'll take that question as a psychologist. And so thank you so much for that question. So, traditional approaches to teaching about diversity, teaching about equity and inclusion, some of the ways that we enter that conversation is you open up a multicultural book and it says something like how to work with African-American clients, how to work with Latinx clients, how to work with LGBTQIA, and it's so forth, so forth, so forth. I haven't seen the book that says how to work with white males. And so what that does is it presumes that everything is centered around white male specifically and white identity as the norm, and everything else is to be other or otherized. And so when we think about otherizing, it says, how is this person different from me? And white is the norm. So instead, what is central and important is to decentralize white identity. And the way that you do that is by asking questions and being very explicit and asking, what is whiteness? What is it to be a male? What is it to be a female? What is it to be non-binary? Asking these questions that quite often we just presume the norm, and then anyone else who's different is supposed to describe their identity. So otherizing really does pose a problem, because what it does to the psyche of the person who is told they're the norm is that obviously I'm the most important person in the room, and I'm going to be generous enough to understand other people. When you're designing your psychology courses, it's really crucial that you teach your students ways that they can identify and pull the lens off of their bias. So one of my favorite exercises to do when I'm doing diversity trainings is to ask people the history of their name. What's your name? Do you know how you got it? Were there ways that your name has been beneficial to you or has been a barrier to you? And so going on that name journey often reveals so many different elements of race, of gender, of class, of access, and it can be a really wonderful opportunity to connect. So I recently did this training and I asked that question, and there were several students in the training that didn't know their name story. They were like, I'm white, name's Amy, don't really know much about it. And so then I asked, what is it like for you to sit in a room where people have a clear story about who they are and their name? Their name is the very thing that they've used their entire lives. It's the first point of contact for a doctor when you see a patient. It has a lot of power. And so what does it mean for you to have never reflected on your name? And the student said, well, it makes me feel like I don't have enough depth, that I'm shallow. And I said, oh, no. It's not an opportunity for you to lean into any guilt. Instead, it helps you realize, how is it possible that I've had this name my whole life and I've never reflected on it? What other areas could I not know in the world if I don't even know the bias related to my name? How many other things could I not know? And so just giving those opportunities to identify how bias could show up opens up the mind, and it really decentralizes whiteness. If Black people or other people of color could have cured racism alone, we would have done it 500 years ago, heck, maybe 1,000 years ago. So it's crucial that we really make sure that everyone has a seat at the table and we're able to have these conversations in inclusive ways, because this is a human condition. It's a socially transmitted disease when we think about racism.
Thank you so much for that answer. I think that's a really important thing for all of us teachers too. For me and for a lot of BioBus teachers and professors to keep thinking about decentralizing whiteness as much as we can. I think we're going to go back to Paula. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marina. And please keep submitting your questions in the chat. We'll definitely bring up some more questions later on. But I want to go back to some of the pre-submitted questions because we just had so many great ones. So this next question is for Bob. What are some examples of racism in science? This is a question from Kelly's.
Well, I tried to describe a number of such studies looking at human intelligence, where the clear intent was to show that being white was intellectually superior as function of group membership in that particular race. But there have been other examples that have tried to understand, amongst other things, in medicine, why certain diseases are more likely to be seen in one group than another. And in many instances, especially if you look at the science that was done at the beginning of the 20th century, there were a number of assumptions that were made about being Black or non-white, much more generally, that informed a kind of science that was more bent on proving the superiority of the white race than it was in looking at important and very critical social differences that existed between the groups. Dana's point about how much this is all about race being how we think socially, that it is something that we created as a way of identifying social differences, not biological differences, is really important, because there was a moment when people tried to prove that those differences were biological and that they were so important that, once again, people who belonged to races that were not associated with whiteness were people who should have the number of children that they have limited, people who were very likely contributing to diseases in the human population. And because studies like this had the banner of science, seeming to suggest that this was a fact, not bias and not prejudice, they had much more weight than they should have. My father, who went to Howard University as both an undergraduate and as a medical doctor, often talked later in his life about how much of the ways in which they were taught about the body, about diseases that are peculiar to the body, often had to have their Black professors at Howard say, okay, this is something that is clearly not true, but it is taught in medical schools all over the United States, so beware. For example, the darker the skin, the heavier the dose of radiation you should use when a patient is being x-rayed. That was horrible. That was horrible. Black skin has nothing to do with anything having to do with the power of x-rays, but it was a way of saying that this is scientific fact that often resulted in a variety of different problems for Black patients that came about not because of their illness, but because someone who had read this bad science was using a tool of science, using a tool of medicine in ways that ultimately did harm. Physicians, doctors, are taught so that when they leave medical school, they not only are very good at what they do, they take an oath to do no harm. And the fact that there was a lot of science, again, at the beginning of the 20th century, that created an image of what it meant to be not white that actually caused a great deal of harm, at least for me, represents some of the worst examples of racism in science that one could possibly imagine. And they did set the cause of what we call minority medicine back a great deal, because we had to undo the negative images of science that those early studies, that those early thoughts, that those early assumptions about differences between one group and another. Having something that tried to combat that was really quite the challenge. And it was some of the most important work that I think that has been done recently to try and undo the impact that that bad science has had on all of us.
Thank you, Bob. Absolutely, absolutely. And so a follow-up question to that then, thanks to Amanda, would be what are some of the ways that we're trying to address that?
Well, at least as a professor at medical school here in New York City, we're trying to make it possible for there to be more scientists like Dana. So part of the way you fight racism is to have the people who are doing science be as diverse as they could possibly be, so that all of the groups in our society are appropriately represented, and all the ways in which our individual groups will look at the world and look at the way science can help us out, will have a voice. Could you say it again, please? So we'll have a voice that will have a lot to do with what's going on. Siri just tried to answer a question, thinking that maybe I wasn't doing it as correctly as I should have. So the whole notion that we're trying to get with programs like this, more of you interested in becoming scientists, we really do believe that the way you correct the evils of the 20th century science that I just talked about would be to have more folk like those of you who are in this audience, part of the group that's trying to make the world better. So forgive me if I'm giving a commercial, but this is exactly why meetings like this. It's exactly why conferences like this are so important, because we really do believe that you are the hope for the future. And if there is going to be something about science that really makes it good for all of us, it'll partially be because you were there doing the work.
Yes, yes, I completely agree. We can all be scientists. Dana, did you want to add something to that?
Yes, thank you so much for that, Bob. And, you know, one of the things that as a psychologist, I'm very interested in the systems in which people organize their thoughts, their understanding, their behavior. And so as we think about ways that science can systematically reduce racism, there used to be a conversation where people would ask the question, you know, is it racist or is it not racist? Now, when you get into those nuances, is it not racist? You're trying to make a case to like, okay, well, I didn't actively do something that was racist. What I invite the next generation and what I hope that you all lead us in beautiful ways is to be very active against racism. So racist versus anti-racist. So it looks like asking the question of what is the way that when I'm treating this patient, how can I be anti-racist? So for instance, in January of 2020, there was a study that came out that looked at first and second year medical students from the American Association of Medical Colleges. And what they found is about 40% of medical students, new medical students in their first and second year, believe that Black people have less sensitive pain nerves, have thicker skin, and are able, their blood is able to coagulate faster, meaning that if I get cut, my blood will stop, I'll stop bleeding faster. This is right now in 2020. And so if you go into medical school and you're in your first and your second year, you have these myths. If you say, well, that's not racist, that's science, and it's some old study, then you're gonna get into these debates that are not really useful. Instead, I invite this next generation to ask the question, how is my science anti-racist? How am I using my science to end racism? How can I use this science to make sure that all humans are getting the best medical care possible? And to me, it's three core pieces that allow us to do that. First is the awareness of our bias and how we got infected with the socially transmitted disease that is racism. The second is an investigation. How do we actively explore what it looks like and what activates racism? And the third is how do we actively reduce the impact on the individual, interpersonal, and organizational racism? And so trainings cannot just say, hey, warm fuzzy, let's talk about diversity. That's great, that's crucial, that's awareness. But we have to get to the point where we are systematically developing policies, procedures, and checkpoints in which all humans are getting the best science possible. And that's the only way that I really think, you know, as we think about things like climate change and racism and bias and all of these things in the world, these are the ways that we're going to be able to really undo those early generations that weren't exploring things in the ways that we are now. So yeah, that's my ad. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dana. And yeah, we all have to do that work together, of course, to make sure that it happens. So I have a question here, and for you, Dana, from Gregor, who wants to know what are some of the psychological effects of systemic racism on people who experience it?
Yeah, so perhaps a metaphor would be useful here. Say on your way to school, every day you're walking down the street and there are lots of people in your neighborhood that look different from you. Maybe based on their race, their gender, their body size. But every day you see this crossing guard and she tells you, and you're white and you're a male, go across the street, and you always get to go first. And then one day she's not there. And you see all these people who look different from you, and you're waiting to see who will cross the street. But you go first because you've always been told that you go first. Some of the things that happen with systemic racism and long-term effects is people internalize the system. It becomes an automatic behavior, an automatic experience. You know, some people say implicit racism is implicit memory. So think about how many times when you were younger, your parents maybe had to tell you to make your bed up or to brush your teeth, and then one day they stopped needing to tell you and you just did it. And so what racism does is it often perpetuates systems that have not been dismantled, that have not been explored. And psychologically, it can limit people because they buy into the myth that I'm not supposed to have a turn. I'm supposed to go second. They internalize it. I don't matter in the same way in the world. If you walk through the grocery store and every image, every cereal box has a white person on it, then one day you go, well, maybe I don't belong in the cereal boxes. If you go to the clothing store and all the models have people who don't look like you, maybe not your body type, then you start to believe then maybe there's something wrong with my body. And so the really tragic part of racism for those who experience it as it being aggressed on them is that it can really decrease self-esteem, lead to depression. And there is some research that shows that actually racism is associated with a common cold. And it has huge impacts on epigenetics, thinking about like our hormones in our body. But the other question that I think often gets ignored is what impact does being racist have on white people? And I think what happens is sometimes that my white brothers, sisters, and non-binary siblings can start to lose aspects of their humanity. They start to say, you know, race doesn't matter, it's not real, stop talking about that stuff, and lose the ability to have empathy for someone who doesn't look like them. And that's when we get in a really dangerous world. Empathy is a very important emotion to be able to access. And so racism just isn't bad for Black people, brown people, tan people, and other, you know, yellow people. It's bad for humanity. And so I think it's important that we look at all aspects of that.
Thank you, Dana. Absolutely. So we have one more question here from Betty. Dana, maybe you want to take this one as well. The question is, why are schools still segregated?
Oh my goodness, why is school still segregated? So this is a big question that requires many different interdisciplinary conversations, such as our sociologists, our economists, our scientists. Everyone needs to be invited to this table to solve this issue. But I think the simplest part, the simplest way to answer it, it has to do with what people are familiar with. You go to the grocery store that is closest to you. You go to your neighborhood school, and the ways that taxes are distributed within a neighborhood and a community. So, you know, often what I find is that people in their thoughts would like diversity, but in the short day-to-day shortcuts of things, they just do what's easy and what's comfortable. So if you grew up in one little neighborhood, you didn't really move. I've moved and lived all over the country, but you didn't really move. Then your kids go to the same school, and then their kids go to the same school, and it just gets perpetuated. That's the part that requires the active piece to be anti-racist, to do something to break down these systems. Schools are not going to become integrated without an effort to integrate them. The same generations will go to the same schools over and over again. And so I think it boils down to habit. But there are other factors that have to do with resources and gentrification that also add to those components of why schools are segregated.
Thank you. Yeah, that goes back to what you were saying. We have to be anti-racist, as the Americans would say. I would say anti-racist. So yeah, thank you so much. If you're just joining us, you are joining the BioBus Student Town Hall on Racism in Science and Society. I'm Paula, and I'm here with Dana Crawford and Bob Fullilove, who are answering your questions. And right now I'm going to pass back over to Marina, who's going to read a couple more questions from the chat.
Hi, everyone. We got a question from Noah, who is 9 years old, and I think this would be a good one for Bob. Dr. Bob, why do white people feel that they are in charge of other races?
Because the history of the United States makes that appear to be true. Monday, we will, as a nation, celebrate Columbus Day. That's the day when a European showed up on the American shores and discovered a land that already had people. How do you discover someplace that people have been living in for thousands of years? One of the things you learn is that when Columbus got here, there began a period that goes almost up to the modern day when Europeans, once they got to this part of the world, the New World, systematically destroyed all the people who were here. there used to be almost 10 million Native Americans, American Indians in the United States. That number is reduced by a very, very great amount. The Aztecs, the Mayans, those are people who were in Central and South America. There is almost no trace of them. There are people who are still part of that tradition, people who are still part of that racial ethnic group. But the civilizations and the cities and the empires that were there when Europeans got here were completely destroyed and wiped out. 300 years of coming to a country and getting rid of all the people who are here gave white folks the sense that this was not only something that they were supposed to do, they actually thought it was a mission that they were on from God. The idea that there was some sort of divine reason why almost all of the world in the 19th and the 20th century could either be conquered or colonized by people from Europe or the United States gave people in that era the sense that this was their manifest destiny, that God intended them to do this. And because so much of that is in our history, when we talk about the conquest of the West in the United States, what we're describing is genocide. But it is portrayed in our movies, in our television shows, and in our novels as a great victory, the triumph of Western civilization over savagery. So the idea that those notions still persist, people are very proud of their cowboy past, very proud of the fact that maybe they had a relative who did really exceptional things in the Philippines or in the conquest of Cuba or what have you. People live with this notion that that manifest destiny that was theirs in the 18th and 19th centuries is still present today. And that to be the head of, or to be a part of the group that is largely running the government of the United States, people believe that this is a continued way of describing how being white means that you are supposed to be in charge. You're the one who's supposed to be calling the rules of the game. And it is only recently that we have all started to question that we've all started to challenge that, and have started to prove that maybe what people have glorified in American history is things that we should actually be ashamed of. So a lot of people are going to describe Monday, a federal holiday, not as Columbus Day, but Indigenous Peoples Day, as a way of celebrating that, okay, Europeans found this place, but guess what? There were folk here. And they had all kinds of civilizations that were noble, that were highly respectful of the environment, that were better able to take care of the land than has been the case since Europeans got here. And the notion of saying that Monday is Indigenous Peoples Day is a way of reminding us of a part of the past that has been forgotten, but that we need to remember so that we understand that the idea that one group should be in charge of everyone else's, that one group has the power to enslave, to conquer, to engage in genocide, and to colonize, that those are ideas that have to basically disappear. As we become an increasingly global world where we're interconnected with everything and everyone else, it suddenly becomes clear that to be European is basically to be in a minority, because the vast majority of the peoples in this world are not. And part of the humility that I think we're all going to have if we're able to exist on this planet together, part of the humility we'll need to get on top of all of the challenges that are on the verge of destroying our environment is for us to understand that we need to work together, that there is no one superior group, that our strength is in our numbers working together, not in being dominated by one group that has an illusion that this is my destiny. How about I leave it at that?
Thank you so much, Bob. That was a really timely example. I think Dana would like to add a little bit more on this.
Yeah, thank you, Bob, for that. And I think, just to add, part of this idea of being in control or dominating another group, I think it's really under-evolved. Think about when you were a little kid, if you have a sibling, I'm an only child, but if you have a sibling and you boss them around and you kind of tell them what to do and how to do it, and you don't include them and you don't let them have a say. But as you become a more collective person, as you realize that maybe they might be fun to play with and they might have something to contribute, then you start to be more inclusive. And so when we previously had values as humans of dominating, of taking, of bullying, then you see groups trying to dominate other groups. You know, you see values around winning wars, creating wars. That is not sustainable as a planet. We will literally destroy all of humanity if we engage in those behaviors. So it becomes very crucial that we become more evolved. And so I think that those ideas of white supremacy and controlling someone has to do with a less evolved idea of how people can come together. And what I'm seeing now, especially with climate change, especially with changes in resources on the planet, with globalization and more exposure, white people and all people are starting to ask, how do we come together and stop dominating, but really to utilize all of our unique voices and experiences and expertise, which really maximizes human functioning. And so I think when I see one group trying to dominate another, I often think it's because they haven't spent enough time developing within themselves their ego strength, who they are as being, what they uniquely have to contribute, that they would think they would need to control someone else, rather than invite and to learn.
Thank you, Dana. I'll throw it back to Paula.
Thank you, Marina. Yeah, we have so many amazing questions. I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but we should keep asking ourselves and each other these questions all of the time, I think. So the next question I think is also for you, Dana. It's from Eric. And Eric asks, how can people unlearn racism?
Yay, my favorite. I love this question. It's very skill oriented. Unfortunately, I don't know if we can ever completely unlearn racism, because it goes back to that piece that humans categorize each other, right? That's just what we do. I see someone down the street and I'm like, oh, blue shirt. It's a category. It's a quick shortcut. We often use these categories because we don't have enough time. We don't have enough energy. We don't have the capacity to really be strategic in our thinking. So we kind of like lazy, you know, racism is a bit lazy. I can just put someone in a category because of their race. I can put them in this category because of their gender. I can put them in this category because of their body type. And so that laziness, people will continue to form categories. The other piece about racism is it's very sneaky. It has a way of constantly evolving. So a great example of this is pre and post 9/11. So for a lot of people, our Muslim brothers, sisters, and non-binary siblings weren't even on the radar of people to be racist towards. They weren't even on the category. Like, oh, I'm just thinking about Black people and white people. And then all of a sudden 9/11, and we got all these images and all these media movies that were bombing and sharing all of these ideas of what Islam is. And then all of a sudden you see all this Islamic phobia spiraling and increasing around the world, right? And so that's the thing about racism. There'll always be some new category to put people in. There'll always be this new way to think that these people should not have resources. That's why it's really crucial that we are constantly very active in reducing our bias, identifying it, and then reducing it. So I don't think we can completely eradicate it. Maybe in your generation, that would be amazing. But I do think that because it continues to evolve, we just have to really stay on top of it. It's sort of like brushing our teeth. You're never going to be able to brush them once and that's going to be sufficient. You got to keep doing it every day.
Thank you so much, Dana. Yeah, absolutely. So the next question is from Ariana, and it's for Bob. And Ariana wants to know, how can inclusivity and accessibility of scientific disciplines better establish public trust in science?
Interestingly enough, this is a problem that I and other people in public health are facing with COVID-19. We are very clear that this virus is going to be with us for a long period of time. Forget what you've heard out of the White House. It's quite likely that it'll be 2022 before we're actually able to say we've conquered and gotten on top of this virus. How are we going to do that? Well, the answer at the moment appears to be we have to develop a vaccine that will be effective enough to keep this bug from being transmitted from one person to another. Well, guess what? Americans don't like taking vaccines. Every year, all of us are supposed to take a vaccine against the flu. We're lucky if 45% of all Americans will do that. Well, now that there's been such a controversy raised around this coronavirus, now that the government is telling us, no, you're going to have a vaccine in a couple of days, and people in the science are saying, no, in order for it to be safe and effective, we've got to do a lot of tests. We're going to have to do that and continue to work on perfecting this until maybe into the middle of next year. So what we're looking at is a problem that even if we develop a vaccine, there's so much suspicion about whether or not it's going to be safe, whether or not it isn't part of some political campaign, that a lot of people are saying, despite the fact that we need to have it, I'm not going to take it. So if you want to know how problems having to do with race are impacting us now, understand how much COVID-19 has heavily impacted communities of color in the United States. We are much more likely, if we're Black or Latinx, to be hospitalized and to die than is the case for white people. That means that if a vaccine is really effective, we need it more than anybody else. But if we doubt the sincerity of something like President Trump, somebody like President Trump, if we're not clear that this vaccine was really science and not politics, we're not going to take it. That means much of what created the racist response to this pandemic is going to continue to haunt us at a moment when we really, really need to trust that science, vaccine science, and medical science actually know what they're doing. And therefore, if we say, take this vaccine, we are to be trusted. But if we're judging messages like that, depending on whether or not we're Black, whether or not we're Hispanic, or whether or not we're white, our response to that message might be very different. That's a way of saying that we have a racialized problem with the messages that we're trying to send. And if those messages are all about getting the American people healthier, that race is a barrier to having everybody listen to that message and react appropriately to it, means that, yeah, this is a problem, and that we're going to have to somehow do our best to eliminate race as a factor in trusting all the advice that's given around COVID-19, and especially all the advice that will be given in the future about getting a vaccine that might save your life and the life of everybody in your community. Of all the things I've been working on, this is the problem that I would say is the most important way in which my having to confront the problems of racism really does dominate what I do every single day.
Thank you, Bob. And yeah, that's such a great example. And we'll be revisiting public health and racism in a later town hall in November. So be sure to join us for that as well. Let's take one last question from the chat now. I'm going to pass back to you, Marina.
All right, we have one last question from Hawa, who I've learned in the chat is one of our interns. Hawa is 14 years old, again from Beacon High School. And Hawa would like to know, how can we help children from low resource neighborhoods who need more resources like science materials obtain them? Is that entirely related to those in power in the government? So this one's open for anybody who wants to answer it.
Well, one of the ways you might want to do it is to demand it. Don't wait for somebody to come your way. That's a really excellent question. It suggests that there are things that you need and you're worried you're not going to get them. Well, you're at that point now in your education where you get to say, excuse me, I'm basically someone who deserves the best education that this country can give me. I can't get that education if I don't have access to all the materials that other students get that make it possible for them to do well in school and perhaps go to college and begin careers that will allow them to be scientists. Your failure to take care of me means that that might not happen. I demand that you do a better job of making sure that I have access to all the things that I need in order to do the work that I want to do when I grow up. Understand that in my 20s, I was part of the student movement. This is when students in the United States actually stood up and said, hey, we don't like what's going on, change. I want to suggest that that spirit lives on today. And if it lives on in you, don't wait for somebody to do something for you. I think you're perfectly within your rights to say, this is something that we should demand. Organize other folk who feel like you to make it clear that it's not just you who wants this, that this is something that your entire community wants to have happen. I do believe that there's an old expression, power concedes nothing without demand. Make the demand. It's the time, it's the moment. And people are ready to hear you when you say, I need more. And I think the folk who are here are really in a position to sort of help you out if that's a demand that will be backed up by folk like us from Columbia University who say, you know, she's right. Do it, please.
Heck yeah. Dana, would you like to add anything else? I know we're almost out of time.
Yeah, I think the bottom line, like Bob said, is it's about using your voice. Right now, you have some of the best resources on this planet, which is the internet. And the internet can give you so many different ways to amplify your voice. You got TikTok, you got Facebook, you got Twitter, you got, GoFundMe. There's so many different ways that you can access resources. The other thing is using your vote. For those of us who are watching this and can vote, you vote sometimes with your pocket. The way that taxes are distributed, I pay for schools to have resources in my community. I live in Harlem. I'm expecting some science resources at that school across the street from me. So I think that's the other piece, is use the resources that you have, amplify the voices around you, and know that you are not alone in this. The world does want this next generation. We want you to lead what needs to happen. Our goal is to plant seeds. Now, please go and grow your tree. Put some water, put some sun on it, amplify your voice. Thank you. And I think just being a part of this today is part of using your voice, getting knowledge and moving forward in that knowledge.
And asking really good questions. The sign of a good student isn't just that you accept what you're taught, that you ask, give me more. Good job. Wonderful.
Well, that's a great note to finish on. Grow your tree and ask good questions. Thank you so much for joining us today for this student town hall. Thank you so much if you submitted a question. If you didn't get it answered, don't worry, you will get other chances to get your questions answered by somebody. Thank you so much as well to our guests, Dana and Bob, for being here to answer our questions. I'm going to clap on everyone's behalf. As I hand back to Latasha, I hope she also has a quick minute to share a cartoon that Dana shared with us representing her work, which is very cool.
So this is a representation of Dana's work. It's so beautiful. Thank you, Dana, for sharing it with us. And thank everyone for attending the BioBus Student Town Hall. And this was so amazing. And I'm sure that you have even more questions. And so submit them. Our next Student Town Hall will be on racism and public health in the first Thursday of November. But right now, I just want to let you know that
you muted yourself.
Sorry, I've only done this 20 times. So I just wanted to give a shout out to the BioBus junior scientists who envisioned this series. We have 2 more to go. And I wanted to make sure that you know to come and do some science with us. Our Explorer at Home challenges have been launched and they'll come on Tuesday. And we want you to come back next week to our Student Town Hall, again at 4 p.m. Next week, it's gonna be Fuego, all about forest fires, and it's gonna be completely in Spanish. So it's gonna be really great. And every 3rd week of each month, our town halls will be broadcast in Spanish. And there's going to be a woman who is a smoke jumper. So I think it's a cool thing. So if you're like me and still kind of learning Spanish, I think it still would be cool to come to hear it. Anyway, and don't forget to visit our sites at biobus.org to get more info, and tag us on social at Twitter, Facebook, all at BioBus. And don't forget to subscribe so that you can know all of the things that we're doing. So have a great day.